I want to move on to the why, right?
And very much a marketing term.
And because as Tamay said, it's been around for a long time. We know that artificial intelligence is nothing new. What's changed? Why should people in this audience care?
Oh my gosh, what's changed? Well, how far do we want to go back? There was something called the AI winter, for example. There was a gentleman by the name of Marvin Minsky at the MIT Media Lab, right, who was looking for this idea of consciousness. I think that, again, the term has morphed. What we mean by it has changed so much over time that I don't want to eat up too much time there. But one question I think that's kind of underlying your question is really, why use AI in this specific use case? I think most of us in this room, perhaps that's also watching from home, have used the tools that are available to us. At the same time, how many of us have wondered, should I be using this for this particular application? Probably not, right? Because it's a new toy. It's fun to play with. It's engaging. It responds to me in a way that I like because I'm telling it how to act and I'm learning along with it, right? But at the same time, I think that as the adults in the room, when I think of accounting, when I think of accountants, I think of you as the adults in the room. You help really promote trust in our society. You help promote trust in the markets. And I think that that key element, that position is incredibly powerful. So why use AI is something that I feel that you as accountants need to be asking in terms of your practices internally, but also of your clients. Are they using it for a good enough reason? And if they are, if it's appropriate, then is it responsibly done? And I think, again, these are the questions that we have to begin with before just jumping in. And essentially, there have been so many lawsuits, and there will be so many more lawsuits, and there's regulation. We'll talk about all of that later on. But when you're trying to evaluate these questions, right, it's really about educating yourself. And as you educate yourself, you educate your team, you educate your clients. Bottom line, is this something that only requires logic, right? Is this something that can be answered through a decision tree? I think probably a tax return is something that's fairly linear, right? So you don't need artificial intelligence, at least I don't think so, certainly not to do my tax return. Let's put it that way. On the other end of things, if you're doing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we actually have an actual accountant on this panel, which is pretty important. But if you were to do forensic accounting or auditing, I would think that it might make sense to use artificial intelligence because AI is very good at pattern recognition, right? So this idea of being able to see broken patterns is something I think that most of us can relate to. For instance, when you get a text message from our bank or from our credit card saying, hey, did you make this purchase? Yes or no? That's AI. That's not a human that's reaching out to you. That's technology that's being used in an appropriate way, not always, but often. It saves us money, it saves us time, it saves us energy. So the question of why, I think, is incredibly important to start.
If people are thinking about predictive analytics, that they're introducing these kinds of technologies, machine learning, into their businesses, they were trying to figure out new ways of understanding the financial landscape. How are machine learning and predictive analysis tools, do you think, how are they going to enhance decision making? And what are the risks around that? Maybe, Juliette, you could start.
So the output is only going to be as good as the input, right? So it all depends on your data, first and foremost. What kind of data are you using? If we're talking about historical data, sui generis, then it's very good at predicting the past, but not necessarily predicting the future. And we all saw this when it came to the pandemic, for example. Very few of us, if any of us, saw that coming. And yet we've got all the tools in the world. We've got amazing brainiacs around the world. None of us saw that coming. So ultimately, I think that it's really, really important to keep into consideration, again, whether you should use AI, but also if you are going to use AI, where is your data coming from? What about the training data that's used, right? What kind of models are you using? You internally, as well as you, your clients. And again, this is your opportunity to educate yourself and really show us how it's done well, how it's done responsibly. I really do feel like you are the adults in the room. And that many of us, if you look at some of the regulation that's coming down the pipeline, for example, out of the EU, we've got a lot of emphasis already, thanks to GDPR, on data, right? And for some of you that are working internationally, you know how big these fines are, how important it is for European citizens to safeguard their personal data, their privacy. You, I believe, have taken an oath as accountants, right? To safeguard privacy, to do things right, to ask the right questions. And I think that we also have to be able to ask better questions of our data, of our practices, of what we're actually trying to accomplish as, we move along this technological journey. And in a larger sense, what is it that we as a society want to do with this technology? Because it's running on all of our data. Right? These LLMs are using data, they're scraping the web. It's coming from all of us and not necessarily the best parts of us. And again, with the education piece, I think that it is fundamental for all of us to educate ourselves. But we're speaking to a room of accountants, so I'm going to pick on you right now. I think that the truth is that your clients rely on you. They rely on your judgment. They rely on your professional curiosity. So I think one really, really powerful place that you all have in the future is to be able to ask better questions of our data, right? Ask better questions of our models and do the same for your clients. How much value can that provide? A whole lot.
Can you remember what the first questions you asked ChatGPT were?
So I was giving a talk here in Las Vegas, actually at the Bellagio for YPO. And they wanted to do an introduction video. And they wanted a bunch of celebrities to talk about me. And it was just one of those moments where it's like, okay, first off, I would never ask anybody to say anything nice about me to go do a talk somewhere. Secondly, I think that we can do a deep fake on some of this stuff and ultimately see what it is that somebody like Elon Musk would say about me, or, Clayton Christensen, or somebody else that's in business. What would they say about me? But the shocking thing, and I don't know if you guys felt this, was that one ChatGPT spit stuff out about me, even though I'm the one who wrote the prompt and knew that most of the stuff was fake. It felt so good. It felt so real and so like, of course, oh my gosh, that's just like, well, what if I just put another name in there? What would they say about me? I wonder what Bill Gates would say about me. I wonder what, right? And I know better. So I think about the average person in the world that is doing this for the first time and how that automation complacency that we were talking about before, how that kicks in and kind of starts to overrule our critical thinking.
Where do you think this is all going? I mean, as you said, we're talking about auditing information that's highly, private and often very, very kind of meaningful when it comes to whatever, markets or whatever. How are you thinking about this?
I'm thinking about it from the perspective of your liability insurance. That's how I'm looking at it. I'm looking at, again, so let me backtrack a little bit. Something that has nothing to do with AI, but I think is a trend to keep an eye on. And I actually posit this in my book, as did Esther Dyson. I think that looking at what has transpired since George Floyd died is very informative. We saw lawsuits. We saw families awarded astronomical amounts of money. And we saw the insurance industry picking up those bills and then turning around and saying to police departments across the United States, especially the small and medium-sized ones, your premiums are about to go through the roof. Police departments trying to push back. Insurance companies saying, no, that's it. If we have to pay these bills, that means that you have to change your practices or else you will not be insured. And we're seeing similar things with insurance companies. I just read recently, and I won't name the insurance company, but there's one that's announced publicly that they will no longer insure people that are buying homes in California.
Yeah.
So people that are already covered, you've got your coverage, but if you now, knowing all the fires and everything that might happen, if you decide to move there, you decide to buy, you will not be insured. So I think that the insurance industry has a huge, huge part to play on how not only we're going to regulate this stuff, it's perhaps even a form of self-regulation in a way. So I think of who is insuring you? Who is insuring your practices? Because ultimately, I do think that the buck stops there.
And I want to come back to you, but I know, Juliette, you're keen to talk about AI ethics and regulation.
I mean, ultimately, right, all of these companies also have their own AI principles, right? What they're willing to do, what they're not willing to do. Actually, I think not necessarily what they're not willing to do. And I think that would be a really, really good question. I think it's a question that we should all ask of ourselves. Like, we're doing this and we're doing that and we're all excited and fired up. But what is it that you are not willing to do to make a buck? And I think that that's something that more companies and possibly more accountants should be asking themselves. That inner responsibility, I think, is really, really important. As I said earlier, I don't believe in this universal ethics. Yeah. I don't believe in this universal ethics. It's ethics for whom, right? And in some cases, if, I step on your toes, then is that ethically correct for you? Probably not. But is it ethically correct for me? Of course it is. It's my turn, right?
Yeah.
So I think that these are very, very dangerous lines, and I'm not necessarily comfortable with saying even that I'm an ethics expert in any way, shape, or form. I think that this is something that we as a global society need to have a conversation about. So one of the things that we were talking about backstage, which I think is really important, is the idea of having actual practitioners participate in the development, like the primary development of a product. Not just the practitioners, but also the people that the technology will affect directly. This is incredibly important. That diversity of thought, and I'm not just talking about race, I'm not just talking about gender or sex, I'm talking about diversity of thought. I'm talking about diversity of education, of culture, being able to see the world from different perspectives. If we work together, we can find solutions that work for more people. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about responsible technology, and that it's up to all of us.
Is this a zero-sum game, or is it going to be additive? It's going to be augmenting human beings rather than replacing them?
I definitely think for the next little while, it's about augmenting human ability, especially when it comes to your fields. I truly believe that this is going to be an amazing tool if we can get it right. So we're talking about, tech partnerships. I think it's also really important to keep in mind that when you're using outside tools, right, regardless of the outside tool, they are still outside tools. So as part of your profession, I believe, again, this whole idea of confidentiality, privacy of the data, what happens when you add more data to something? Is there a potential that there would be some visibility there all of a sudden? Like, these are all things that you really have to start thinking through and probably already have begun thinking through for your clients. Right? So if they're deploying an LLM, whether it's a BARD or, ChatGPT 3 or 4, regardless, the point is that this is coming from the outside, right? So there's much more likely to be data breaches, much more likely to be hackability issues, and so on. If it's something that was built internally by your client, was it done well? How was it done, right? So this is where you come in. This is where you, the humans, you, the adults, you, the ones have decided to educate yourselves. This is where you rule. Those are the jobs that are most easily automated, right? Like, how do we, Juliette, do you want to jump Sorry.
in on this?
So one of my favorite new jobs, and I talked to you about it behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Chat prompt engineer. Chat prompt engineer. What, the starting salary is something like $150,000? You don't know what to do? You don't know what to study? You want to change careers? I mean, I would definitely look at that. I absolutely would look at that. So I think that just as when we saw with the Industrial Revolution, right? It changed the type of jobs. It displaced some people, absolutely. But would we change that today, looking back? Let me just jump in for one small point. So I think the pandemic, again, redefined what it meant to be a student, what it meant to be an employee, what it meant possibly to be an accountant, I don't know. But ultimately, one thing that I did during the pandemic is I went back to school. I went to Columbia. I decided, why not? I can do this. Yes, I can. And I did. And ultimately, what I learned was a whole slew of things, including, oh, shoot, I already knew that just in a completely different context. Now let me apply that knowledge to a new model, to a new industry, to a new way of thinking. And we all do that as humans. We're really, really good at it. That pattern matching that we're trying to do with our AI, guess what? We're really, really good at it already. So I think that one of the key elements that I really took away that responds to your question about entry workers is that now to be a student, at least at Columbia, and I suspect at many universities and colleges and in some cases high schools, is that you actually have to know Python. You have to know R to even be looked at as a candidate for admissions. So what is that new entry-level skill set? Well, if those people are arriving with those skills, of course they want to deploy them. And of course you, as responsible managers, have to make that decision, does that make sense or not? So that entry-level job has changed because the entry-level person is changing.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
In fact, so one of the things that I wrote in the book, and back to your question from earlier, how can we communicate? Honestly, it's an excellent question because I do think that if you're talking to a regulator, you're going to communicate very, very differently than if you're going to talk to a group of accountants, than if you're going to talk to, K-12, if you're talking to your grandmother, right? These are all very different levels of explainability. And when we talk about explainable technology, explainable AI, open the closed box, and, I don't really like the black box, but I think that we all know what we're referring to here. This idea of why do you want to do that? Well, because you need to explain it to the people that are being affected by the technology. So if in a completely different use case than any of yours, surely, for whatever reason, I get identified through facial recognition that apparently I did something, right? How am I going to push back against that? And that's why we need explainability. That's why we need to understand how these systems work. In that context, as humans, we biologically crave control. And our devices and our systems give us that sensation of control, the illusion of control in many cases. And that's what we need to pay attention to, and to not just do it in our work hats. I think that there are many different logics of power around technology, and I only name 4 in the book, but ultimately we're talking about the engineering logic, right? And that's very, very, it's technical, it's efficient, right? It wants to get things done well and right the first time in the best possible way with the least amount of energy and cost for the most part. When you think about it from a regulatory perspective, the governmental perspective, it's about control. It's about making sure that my citizens are safe, making sure that bad actors stay away, or finding them using exactly the same technology, right? Our surveillance state uses the same technology. When we think about corporations, what are they trying to do? They're trying to augment their bottom line. They're trying to make sure that they fulfill their own responsibility, their fiduciary responsibility to the, and then there's a social justice aspect. Like, we as humans, what is okay and what is not okay? And if it's okay for you, is it okay for me? And is it okay for you too? Right? So all of these logics are playing simultaneously around our systems. And I think it would be a mistake not to think of all of them simultaneously. Right? Don't just think about it with your accountant's hat on. Don't just think about it with your bleeding heart hat on. Think about it, try to hold this. We have this capacity as humans to be able to hold multiple logics simultaneously in our minds, project into the past and into the future. What kind of future do we want to build? And I think that's a really key element in all of this.
Thank you. Juliette.
I like that a lot. I would like to see engineers be certified in responsibility. In that, if we have mechanical engineers, if we've got, other electrical engineers, they de facto are responsible for their work, right? They are certified for their work. And they are recertified for their work over time. That does not happen in computer science. That does not happen, for the most part, on systems engineers. It just does not happen. So that is something I would like to see. I think we need to see. In terms of responsibility, I also think that we have to remember that whether we call it machine learning, artificial intelligence, neural networks, ultimately, what we're talking about is socio-technical systems, which means that the technology does not exist without us. Our data is running through these systems, and these systems shape our behaviors. Think about how many of us pulled out our phones during this conversation, right? What are we doing next? Who are we having dinner with? Who are we dating, right? All of these things are determined now, for the most part, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not, by our devices that are running this technology. So all of this to say that I think that, that accountability piece is huge for all of us. And that's what I want to see in our future. I want to see all of us feel responsible for the socio part of the technical and really start to use our critical thinking in terms of the results that we get on a minute-by-minute basis. Like, is this actually, right, the best route to get from A to B? I know this city better than the system does. Does that actually make sense? Is it taking into account that the Grand Prix is coming and as a result they're repaving the roads in Las Vegas, right? Is that actually baked into the old data? Probably not. So again, that responsibility, I think, is all of ours.